Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 251, Public Opinion. MASH left the church with Luke, but Luna needed to stay behind for something. Apparently, she had skipped some work and needed to catch up on it. Luna complained that there was a surprising amount of boring speeches involved with being a priestess. He expected she had plenty of that lined up for the day, and he didn't want to stick around for that. However, he didn't really want to go with Luke either. Luke needed to visit a few more temples and meet with the king. All of which sounded incredibly tedious. The meeting with Elise had been surprisingly okay. That didn't mean that he forgot about the terrible entrance to the temple. He could only imagine how much more annoying the other temples would be if Luna wasn't there to cling to them. His presence would probably cause more fights. He kind of wished that Jill had taken him with her. Well, she missed out on a rather informative conversation with the moon goddess. The journey through the temple had been filled with dubious glances. Many paladins miraculously stumbled upon their paths, and one time they even had a weapon in hand too. That one had earned a rebuke from Luna, but honestly, he preferred it to the stairs. He was almost eager as he stepped out into the streets. In fact, he was so eager that his step was a bit too forceful. The stone beneath his foot cracked and there was a loud thump. Mash grimaced as he heard several gasps from outside of the temple. He looked up, already having an idea of what to expect. His domain had let him see one or two people who stared openly at the temple's entrance. He took in the sight. Many people stood in the street. They stood shoulder to shoulder. He didn't see any children, but plenty of adults were standing around. Some guards and adventurers decided to join in as well. Mash didn't see any fancy dresses or suits. He expected that some nobles would be aware of what was happening, but he wasn't important enough to get them here physically. All of them watched the temple entrance. Even before he heard the first words, he knew that they were there because of the earlier disturbance. They were there to see him. He did not like feeling like some kind of exhibit. Though he would probably do something similar. A rumor traveled quickly, that was a lesson he learned as a small kid. His overly loud step had somehow brought silence to the crowd, but it was quickly filled with whispers. Many of which he could hear. "It's the monster. I heard he attacked the temple. What about his siblings? I heard that he was a bastard. Why did the church just let him go?" The rumors were loud and ridiculous. To their credit, they were attempting to whisper. It just didn't work when dozens of people were doing it. There were plenty of more offensive things said, and some were actually true. He was not human, that much was true. This did make him remember the goddess. These people had no idea that their goddess was not human, did they? He briefly considered telling them. A second's thought told him that they would probably just assume he was lying. Luke was standing beside Mash, and he was receiving a fair portion of the whispers too. This city was really good at getting information. People were already calling him a demigod. How had that even happened? The commotion earlier hadn't been that big, had it? Mash looked over the crowd. They were blocking every street quite well. As annoyed as he was, he wanted to just push right through them. It wasn't like they could stop him if he did. He held back and turned to Luke. "I'll go meet with the king, and head back after. No offense, but this seems tiresome." Mash waved his hands, gesturing to the crowd. Luke nodded. "Yeah, I'm not too sure about this either. But I will do what I need to." That was all that needed to be said. Mash walked slightly away from Luke. The crowd seemed to copy his movements. They took steps back as he went forward. At least they didn't look like they wanted to stop him. He wouldn't press the matter either. The people were scared for all that they showed up to observe him. Even if his domain didn't let him get an idea of a person's feelings, he could have read it on their faces. The slightly widened eyes. The way they pressed close together yet still shuffled a little bit. These people had come here expecting a spectacle and had been hoping for something exciting. They wanted to have a story to tell. Mash didn't meet their expectations. Wooden wings sprouted from his back, growing to a small size. They weren't even as long as his arms. He flew up into the air, mostly relying on his affinity to fly away. He didn't fly into the castle, that would probably be stupid. As he flew, he looked for a place to land. Instead, he spent a little under an hour just flying around. The town was rebuilt, but he was able to notice where the town had been reformed. The stone was newer in some places. There was a park that he didn't remember before. At the edge of the town, he also noticed a graveyard. It was there before, but now the tombstones covered almost all of the available space. The town was busy, and he saw several people walking toward the temples. They were probably trying to catch Luke or see one of the other gods. The air was kind of chilly as the day changed to night. The sun was still up, but it had definitely grown colder. The wind wasn't strong enough to impede his flying, although it helps him relax. It was just cold enough that he enjoyed it. Unlike the frozen snowlands up north, this was more like a gentle autumn breeze. The weather around the capital was usually well controlled, but his brother had told them that most people were too busy to regulate it. They were only preventing the worst things but didn't bother with chill winds or rain. His brother had told them that more monsters had been appearing, and most knights and guards were extraordinarily busy now. Even adventurers were being forced to enter and explore dungeons. There were quotas now for each adventuring rank. His group was spared the requirement. Well, they had already surpassed it with their last dungeon clear. The dungeon they had cleared last finished their quota for this month. They would get assigned another quota once the month ended, but it wasn't such a big deal. The guild struggled to enforce the quota, and it was hard to keep track. Some dungeons would take months while others took a few hours. It must be a hassle for the guild. His thoughts wandered, as he found a place to land. It was an empty section near-ish to the castle, but well hidden from the streets. 3 buildings met in such a way that there was only one narrow exit from the triangular space. A truly perfect location. That went through Mash's head as he slowly descended into the weirdly well-hidden alleyway. If he had thought about it more, he would have realized that it must have been designed to hide from prying eyes. He did not make that connection though and was completely relaxed as his feet met with the stone ground. Mash's domain let him see a lot, but seeing and understanding were different things. He had felt mana on the ground, but much of the city had some enchantment or another on the streets. Seeing a little mana like this would normally be nothing. Honestly, he had felt pretty safe in the town. Even if he wasn't the most liked, he was related to enough important people that the worst he would receive were some names. That was what he thought, as the mana in the ground rose to cover him. It wrapped around him a shimmery outline of chains rolling over his body within a second. He didn't even think to stop it before it was too late. The energy that he had been recovering from the wooden wings had stopped. Whatever the chains did, sealing his energy recovery was on the list. He also felt that his skills had been sealed, and to make matters worse that included his domain. The sudden disappearance of his domain was disorienting. Enough to make him stumble backward. It was a sense that he had relied on for so long. It was like losing his sense of smell or something. It wasn't like he needed it, but it was just so startling that it forced his mind to react. It slowed his reactions, but the bigger problem was the reliance he had built on it. To him, this was worse than going blind. Mash tried to calm himself. One thought popped into his mind: he needed to get out of here. There were 3 buildings that surrounded him. None of them had any windows facing this clearing, and there was only one narrow alley that would let him out. That alone wouldn't be a problem. The issue was that people were blocking the one exit now. 3 knights stood casually in the alleyway. It was narrow enough that one had to stand behind the other 2. Mash could see past them and saw another knight leaning against one of the buildings, a lookout. They were wearing the same armor his brother had, though it was not as polished or adorned as Arthur's set. Most of the knights' faces were hidden behind helmets. The helmets were large and had visors that only had narrow slits for their eyes. One of them had raised their visor though. Mash stared at one of the ugliest people he had ever seen. It was not a nice thought, but the man's face was just wrong. His nose was bent in 2 different directions before straightening out. It had to be the result of poor healing, yet the man never took the time to get it healed properly. Worse than that were the dark circles around his eyes. It had to make up. He had seen that occasionally on some girls but had never seen it on a man. They were too dark and noticeable too. The man was ugly to the point that Mash believed it was a disguise. Knights who used lookouts and disguises probably weren't good people. Mash straightened his stance and took in his condition more carefully. Priscilla told him that all of his skills were blocked, though it hadn't weakened him otherwise. His stats were unchanged. That was good. He still had his wooden wings too, but he couldn't fly without his magic. These wings were too small to actually lift him on their own. He regretted not making them bigger and wished he had used a transformation instead. He doubted that this seal would have ended his transformation. It didn't end the subtle things he had done to improve his body. He didn't always adjust his body, but he felt like something big would happen today. So he had minorly changed his body to make it more responsive. Altering his muscles to match the wolf or dragon more closely wasn't a huge drain on his energy. Now, how about you tell me what you're doing here? The knight's voice was disturbingly wrong. His voice cracked constantly, and his pitch changed often. He was definitely trying to disguise his voice. Without his domain, Mash wasn't able to accurately gauge the strength of the men. However, this didn't put him off. Even without his domain, he could tell that this would lead to a fight. A smile spread across his face, and he didn't even try to stop it. Chapter 252, Corruption. Mash couldn't stop the smile, nor did he want to. As much as he hated killing other people, fighting them was way more exciting than monsters. Most people would be terrified at having their skills sealed. People with the ability to do that were rare, and he should probably be warier. He couldn't change himself just by thinking about it. His heart was beating quickly, his blood churning through his body. The excitement was filling him with energy, urging him to fight. These people weren't likely to just let him go, but he would give them the chance. I'm just going to the castle, this just looked like a convenient place to stop. Mash wasn't a liar, so he didn't bother with it. Even if they trusted him, he doubted it would change their plans. He wasn't normally the best at noticing the small things, but these people were incredibly suspicious. This seal is much stronger than the last. Even if I can break it, it would take a while. You will need to fight them without skills. Oddly, Mash wasn't really scared. If anything, he was calm, eager, and a little bit hungry. He wouldn't eat them, but he was always hungry. Priscilla's message only added to the thrill. Oh, and why would someone like you be visiting the castle? The ugly man grinned himself. Even he could tell where this conversation was headed. Mash was going to reply, but one of the other knights spoke. Wait, isn't he the ice guy's brother? The monster from earlier. The man who had spoken had let his hand fall to the hilt of his blade. He had a plain-looking broadsword at his waist. The ugly man in the middle didn't let his expression change. He still wore a grin. Although, Mash couldn't help but think that someone that hideous shouldn't grin like that. It only stretched his already problematic face. After getting interrupted once before, Mash decided to try again one more time. Although, they denied him the ability to speak once again. I think the brother of that ice demon is more than good enough. The man's eyebrows narrowed a little and his smile broke when he mentioned Arthur. Ice demon was a new name for his brother, though an appropriate one. However, that all but confirmed the fact that these weren't good knights. Mash didn't really care what their plans entailed. He could find out after capturing them. That didn't mean that he shouldn't take some precautions, and he told Priscilla to alert Arthur of the situation. Even if his brother knew, it would still take him a few minutes to get here. Mash's storage space opened beside him, and he swiftly grabbed a wooden staff as one of the knights leaped at him. The knight's metal boots were loud as he kicked off the stone ground. A gauntlet hand carried a wide broadsword. The knight made a surprisingly compact swing, though Mash had seen better from his brother. He was prepared for the strike, and he dodged the blow to the side. His staff met the top of the swinging blade. It was fast, and the blade sparkled with a purple light. The effect seemed to come from the knight's hand. A skill in all likelihood. However, the knight didn't have the speed necessary to make that work. The staff's weight multiplied as he pushed the broadsword to the ground. Mash's swing made the knight stumble forward. The metal clanked loudly, as Mash stepped past the knight and kicked backward. The knight wasn't incompetent though and had only stumbled from the surprise. He turned his fall into a roll. The sound of metal grating against stone was annoyingly loud, but he ignored it and leaped toward another of the knights. All of the other knights had used the initial attack to space themselves around Mash. They were surrounding him, only one remained by the alleyway. It was the lookout. The one knight in the narrow escape wasn't particularly intimidating. He was the smallest of the knights, and probably a foot shorter than Mash too. He probably could have escaped if he really tried, but he didn't want to do that just yet. It might have been arrogance, but he wanted to test himself against these people. His stats were a little higher than what someone could expect at his level, and the first knight hadn't been all that fast. Skills could make the difference. Even still, he didn't think these people could beat him. Mash wasn't planning on killing these fake knights though. It would probably be better to escape first. He considered it again briefly but decided against it. Instead, he turned his leap into a roll, avoiding a swinging fist. The ugly man was faster than the previous knight, but the difference was negligible. The roll ended with Mash's back to one of the building's walls. He quickly rose to his feet and yelled a word aloud. Attack! It was a single word and one that made no sense to any of the knights. They glanced toward the entrance as if they expected a dozen knights to jump out. Nothing came from there though. Although, something did attack. From his still open storage space, a wooden replica of himself jumped from the portal. It was one of his exact replicas and the only one he had saved. His storage space had a finite amount of ambient mana, but one replica could last a day or two inside. Mash had made one and stuffed it in there. He didn't know if he would need it, but it was definitely as good as the rest of his weapons. As the wooden puppet jumped at the knight with the broadsword, Mash did the same too. He wasn't going to let the knight's confusion go to waste. He thrust the staff forward as fast as he could and aimed it at the still open visor. He aimed right for the center of the man's face. What would more broken nose even matter? The staff hit squarely in the man's nose. The sound of breaking bones was noticeable, and the knight stumbled backward. The knight didn't take the attack freely. The ugly man moved far faster than before. His hand came out in a blur that Mash could barely keep up with. Mash only had enough time to jump a little. It was a small motion, but it was enough to get his head out of the way. The ugly man's gauntlet fist still met with Mash's shoulder. The strike had some serious power behind it, but it wasn't enough to break bones. Especially because Mash had jumped with the motion of the blow. He turned in the air though, and skid across the ground with his other arm. The ugly man didn't have any weapons. It was one relief, as a sword there would have led to a much more devastating wound. Mash tried to correct his posture. He almost managed to turn the slide into a roll, but the third knight took that moment to join the fight. A boot connected with the center of Mash's back. Without his domain, he hadn't been able to keep track of everyone, and he didn't even brace for the blow. That was bad, but his body was more durable than normal, and his muscles protected his bones. The kick did send him into a nearby wall. If the other two weren't dazed or distracted, then the fight might have ended at that very moment. Instead, the kick made enough distance to let him get back on his feet. His back hurt as he used the wall to support his stance. Mash briefly glanced at the other two, before turning his glare to the knight who had kicked him. The knight with the broadsword was struggling with the wooden replica, and the ugly man was still on his back. Mash wondered if he had used too much strength. The sound of the man's nose breaking had been wet, and it easily could have rattled the man's brain. If that was the case, then the man's counterattack was probably part of a skill. A passive one at that. That would make this fight more complicated. If he was out of the fight, for now, that was good enough. Now, he just had 3 more knights. He included the one by the exit, even though the man would probably run away if he beat the remaining 2. The broadsword knight was the weakest, and even with skills, he couldn't beat the wooden imitation easily. It was hard for Mash to tell how strong his imitations were, but apparently, it was enough to match a weaker knight. His imitation would eventually lose, but it could still distract the man well enough. That left the one that had kicked him. This knight had a large shield and a small, short sword. The contrast was weird, and Mash assumed that there was a trick involved here. Either the sword, shield, or both were magical. They glowed faintly, but it was clear that the mana wasn't coming from the knight himself. That was only a little troublesome. This knight was the best equipped, which probably meant that they were one of the stronger ones. The shield was another annoyance. His staff was surprisingly good at deflecting weapons, but it wouldn't be punching through a shield anytime soon. The knight saw Mash's hesitation and moved forward. They probably thought that he was hurt, which wasn't entirely wrong. The kick would definitely leave a nasty bruise. Well, it would if he couldn't heal it after the fight. It wasn't bad enough to slow him though, and Mash tried to take advantage of his speed and get around the large shield. It would have worked if not for the ground beneath his feet moving and trapping his right foot in place. Normally, he would have seen it with his domain. Mash had come to rely on the ability to see all around himself. His foot was stuck, and he started falling forward. He caught himself by using the staff to keep himself upright. It struck the ground as he put his weight against it. The force was enough to crack the ground. The knight had planned this, and the man's shield was cold to the touch. Oddly, Mash focused on the chill as it pushed against his face. It slammed into him and easily flung him back into the wall. His back crashed into the stone, causing him to wince from the pain. The earlier kick made the impact feel worse than it was. Mash grunted and swung with the staff. He had managed to hold onto his staff. He swung the staff in an upward motion, and it met with the knight's short sword. It was fine, he was just getting some distance. He brought it down with even more strength and struck the stone across his foot. Even without any skills, he was more than strong enough to break some stone. It shattered and he stepped to the side. This knight could manipulate the stone to some extent, and that made keeping his back against a stone wall a bad idea. It was too bad that he was completely surrounded by stone. The knight swung his sword again, and this time the stone lanced out beside his swing. It came quickly and Mash couldn't block all at all. He wondered why they hadn't just used this from the beginning but didn't have the time to consider it more carefully. A stone spear cut into his side, but he twisted enough to avoid anything worse. Mash's staff on the other hand met with the side of the knight's helm. He had twisted it around the man's shield. It was a difficult maneuver, but he got a little lucky. The helm's visor flew up from the strike, and Mash caught a glimpse of strangely purple eyes. It was not a normal color, but he noticed something else about their features. They had narrow eyes and pale skin. It was a distinctly foreign look, and Mash knew that he had stumbled upon something much larger than he had initially believed. This wasn't just a case of corruption, was it? Chapter 253, Foreign Fighters. They were foreigners. Not corrupt knights, but spies for another nation. Mash couldn't remember the last time this kingdom had been attacked by another. It was so long ago that he only ever heard of it in legends. The presence of these people was unexpected. He had an idea of where the knights were from. The narrow eyes and pale skin were obvious signs of someone from the east. Mash shook his head. He was jumping to conclusions. Just because one knight looked like that didn't mean anything. Maybe the knight's parents had moved here or something. It wasn't a very common thing, but it happened. Can you really not handle a single person who can't even use their skills? The knight who had been acting as the lookout was entering the fray. They sounded like a man, and his voice didn't sound obfuscated. It seemed like he didn't care much about disguising himself. The man had an interesting accent where each word seemed to end abruptly. The sentence still flowed normally, but it felt like he emphasized the end of every word. The knight with short sword and shield slowly backed away from the approaching man. The hierarchy was obvious, and Mash realized that this man was the leader. "I'm sorry, sir." When the knight he had just been fighting apologized, Mash realized that they weren't speaking in the common language. This knight had used a different language, but Mash's translation item was still working, and he could understand what was said. The accent matched the leader's own accent, and Mash was growing more suspicious of the group. If only one of the knights was foreign, then he could still hope that it was just a matter of corruption. The exchange told him that probably wasn't the case. The leader responded to the knight with a sharp glare before turning to Mash. His words were directed at him. "Well, you are quite the fighter. It's a shame, if you hadn't seen our faces, we could have let you go." That was the confirmation that Mash didn't want to hear. A foreign power was looking to encroach on this kingdom. It had been decades since the last major war. This kingdom had too many high-leveled individuals in it. Wars would always boil down to fights between the strongest, and the king was famous for his fighting prowess. The gods wouldn't get involved, but wars were still risky endeavors for both kingdoms. "Run, he is strong. You will win with skills." Priscilla's message was heard, but Mash didn't say anything. Escaping was probably the right decision, but he wanted to test the leader's strength. Test his own strength when he didn't have access to his skills. He didn't really know how to respond to them and decided to take the first swing. This man was probably the highest leveled of the group, but Mash doubted that they could match his raw stats. He stretched his leg out, partially lunging as he swung his staff in a wide circle. Big swings were best for his enchantments. The staff gained weight proportional to the speed of the swing. Even without his domain, Mash could tell that this man was dangerous. He decided a few broken bones, or a concussion would be acceptable in this situation. Honestly, Mash was mostly moving on instinct. His senses told him to try and kill the man, and he wasn't going to distrust his instincts. The man raised a gauntlet hand to catch the staff. At the last second, he seemed to change his mind, and instead pushed up on the staff. It skidded of the gauntlet and clipped a small corner on the man's helm. The metal crumpled a little and the staff kept going, tearing of a small section of the helm. That seemed to make the man grow far more alert. The knight had been somewhat casual thus far, but he recognized what had almost happened. If the knight had maintained his arrogance. The knight with the shield had relaxed when their boss had stepped forward. Mash took advantage of that. His swing had been sent high with the leader's nudge, but it was still heading toward the other knight. Mash brought the staff downward, aiming for the man's left shoulder. It was the sword-wielding hand. The knight was fast enough to react and raised his sword to parry the blow. The whole swing had taken less than a second, but the leader still tried to warn his companion. No, dodge. It was too late to change. The knight might have a skill to help him parry the blow, but his leader's shout had clearly confused him. It delayed his already slow reaction. Enough so that Mash's staff was able to break the short sword and rip through the man's arm. His whole arm crumpled from the force. Blood gushed out from where the armor broke and dented. The knight's arm almost came clean off, but Mash's staff was stopped by stone that had risen from the ground. It crawled up the knight's body, turning to armor. It stopped his staff, but the damage was done. That man's left arm would be worthless without some serious healing. Mash was good at fighting. That much was obvious. Regardless of what his class was, he had always been somewhat good at fighting. The knight who he had struck kind of just slumped in place. They were held up by the stone, but they would not be rejoining the fight. Mash didn't have the time to relax and pushed off the stone armor. He tried to make some space with the leader. He needed to reopen his storage space and grab another weapon. His staff was stuck in the person and Mash didn't want to risk trying to hold onto it. His jump was too slow, or maybe the leader was just angry now. The man leaped at Mash. He had no weapons in hand but began to swing like he was holding something. Both of his hands seemed to be gripping a handle, and he twisted his body. Mash didn't see anything, but he felt when something collided with his side. Thankfully, it wasn't a sword. If it was a sword, Mash might have died. This was only a little better as he felt something large and flat hit his side. It was a hammer, and its head was easily as big as Mash was. His whole body squished a little against the phantom weapon. When it made contact, it flashed into existence for a second. He didn't miss the bright red color of the hammer, nor did he miss the fact that the handle was made of bone. It was a legendary weapon, and one that Mash recognized. The Throne Breaker was a famous weapon, and Mash had liked as a kid. It had been a personal favorite of his. The weapon was said to have been forged with bones of giants. According to the legend, a single swing of the hammer had been enough to break castles, to shatter thrones and destroy kingdoms. A single swing from the hammer can break more than just the body. And Mash got the pleasure of experiencing that strike. The strike was strong, and Mash crashed to the ground. His whole body was screaming in pain now. The hammer strikes felt like it somehow hit him in a dozen different places. He felt blood running down his cheek, and his right arm was broken. The sharp pain there was something he could recognize. However, that wasn't all the weapon had done. His vision had broken. It was like he was staring through shattered glass. He saw 10 slightly warped versions of the knight, and Mash knew that the situation was getting rather prickly. It was time to get out. No one was watching the entrance anymore. Even with his broken vision, Mash was able to follow the man's next swing. He had an idea for how big the hammer was. The weapon was hidden from his sight, but he had a feel for it. Mash used the swing to his advantage and pushed off of it with his wings. He let them break while he pushed away from the hammer. The metal of the hammer was hot, and he could have sworn that he smelled smoke. The wings broke and pain spread from his back. His aim wasn't perfect, but he managed to stumble into the alleyway. His head ached, and his broken vision made it hard to figure out what was happening. The fight had been going well, but he couldn't have expected them to have a weapon like that. Mash knew that Priscilla was communicating with his brother, but he wouldn't make it fast enough. The problem with fights at this level were that they happened quickly. Everything that had happened had been less than a minute. Jill could get here, but she wouldn't know until she got back. He was really only able to tell his siblings at the moment. Mash took a step, but then fell forward and crashed into the ground. His chin stuck the stone floor and slammed his teeth together. It hurt. Even with all of his stats, that still hurt. Mash tried to get to his feet, but his hand slipped forward, and he face struck the concrete. He heard the sound of metal against stone and knew that the knights were coming. What was happening? Unlucky. Your sense of balance was broken second, hey? What was the first? The man was not hiding his abilities. He was probably certain of his victory at this point. Mash couldn't really argue. While the vision was an impairment, it wasn't that bad. If the man was being honest, his sense of balance was far more important. Especially, for his fighting style. Most of his attacks relied on rotation, and he doubted that he could manage that. He couldn't even stand correctly. If only he had skills. He could use magic to adjust and use his domain to maneuver. That was a dumb notion. If he had his skills and magic, this fight would have ended in an instant. Mash was angrier at himself than these men. He still thought he could have won. He had taken a few hits that he hadn't needed to. At least one injury had been completely avoidable. Priscilla sent a message and confirmed his thoughts. Yes, you were stronger and faster than them. Even without skills you could have won. Although you should have just escaped. Fighting was a mistake. Shadow covered the ground, and Mash knew that the knight was standing behind him. Despite his situation, Mash didn't think that they would kill him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't feel any of that cold intent. No, they had other plans for Mash. He struggled a little but managed to turn onto his back. He stared up at the knight who was looked down at him. His eyes were only barely visible through the visor, and he saw purple eyes peeking through. Brace yourself. Your brother will be able to find you. Priscilla seemed to believe that they wouldn't kill him either. Mash wondered what they had planned that they were leaving him alive. Nothing was said, but the gaze told Mash that he had lost. He decided he hated sealing skills. They were rare and powerful. The leader raised his invisible hammer overhead. Mash could tell what was coming and tried to brace himself. He raised both arms to shield his face, his broken arm stinging as he moved it. He shut his eyes tightly. He heard the wind shift from the swing and felt the hot metal touch his arms. Everything went black a second later. Crack. Chapter 254, Kidnapped. If someone had told Mash that he would be kidnapped today, he would not have believed them. Or maybe he would have considered who was strong enough to pull something like that off. Here he was, stuck in a caravan that was slowly trotting along. It bounced often but irregularly, which probably meant that he wasn't on a road or anything. His back was against a wooden wall, and he felt an itch on his nose. He imagined reaching for it with one of his hands, only to find that he had no hands to use. Actually, his whole arm was missing. Both of his arms were. It had caused him to panic at the start, but he calmed down quickly with some help from Priscilla. They had removed both of his arms earlier. It happened while he was unconscious. They did the bare minimum amount of healing too, and he still felt some pain in both of his shoulders. The pain wasn't a big deal, but the injury itself was distracting. You can heal it easily enough with your skills. I have almost broken the seal. This was the third time she had sent that message. She had repeated that several times to calm him down. He wondered why his brother hadn't caught up, but Priscilla told him that they had been teleported. That was a problem. It meant that Jill was the only one who could help him, and she had said that she would be gone for the entire day. He sighed and turned to work on the seal with Priscilla. Even without his domain he had surprisingly good control over his body. The seal was a physical thing in his body, and he saw it wrap around his core. The phantom chains still faintly showed on his body, but they were clearer within his body. He decided to take his observation a step further and used the earrings. They couldn't remove his items, but it was clear that they had searched. They had stripped him of everything, his clothes and items included. Although they couldn't do anything about the tattoos around his neck and head. Although they had dealt with the ones around his arms. Even without his limbs he still felt the connection to the magic items. He could still use them, but that wouldn't be very useful now. The ugly man was still watching him, although Mash thought that he might be asleep. His vision warped and he found himself within his being. His soul, as he chose to call it, was a unique place. At first, someone might think it looked like his world, but there were a few very significant differences. The fruit that represented his golden body was quite a bit large now. It covered nearly half of the tree and it urged him to eat it. He got the idea that he would get more by waiting but felt the urge even more strongly now. He ignored it and looked at the rest of his soul. His core had its own representation here. Not the tree, but empty skies that filled was his core. In the past it had been blemished by the marks of those greater beings and the class system, it was clear now. Despite the color of his scales and the general darkness of his wood, his mana was much brighter. It was a light shade of blue mixed with green, and it was unblemished. The sky had its color but something else speckled the usually empty sky. It wasn't like the marks or the class system, instead, he saw a small star in the sky. It wasn't big enough to be called a sun, and it radiated a black light that was distinctly unnatural. The seal or some kind of visualization of it had appeared. This place was strange, and he had a certain degree of control of the space. He was able to move and examine things in ways he couldn't do outside. It was how he learned about his marks and managed to diminish them. He was able to make them smaller and planned to do the same with the seal. He stared up at the dark star. It pulsed with black energy that crept on the otherwise beautiful sky. Mash had to admit that it looked pretty cool. That wasn't the point. He brought himself closer to the star. It was strange moving in this place. He didn't fly, but he didn't teleport. It was like he squeezed his world and slid across to where he wanted to be. The closer he got to the star, the more he grew more entranced by its visage. The star was being contained by a series of moving chains. More chains flowed in and out of the dark light. It kind of reminded him of a puzzle. There were string puzzles like it, but he imagined that it wouldn't be that easy. It was too large for him to pull any one chain though. The star rose to his feet, and he saw markings on the chains. He wondered what it could mean. There was something familiar about the engravings, and he tried to think of where he had seen them before. It wasn't Eiffel's enchantments. Mash reached down, glad to realize that he had both arms within his storage space. Did he have his skills in here? Would it change anything if he did? He might as well try. He tried to change one of his arms. The chains probably wouldn't be able to handle his dragon form. The strength he gained from the form was just too significant. Sadly, his body didn't change. It didn't seem like he had access to any of his skills. While annoying, he still wanted to try breaking the chains. His fingertip touched the chain, and pain crawled up his arm. It felt like a needle had been driven into the finger. He recoiled and flinched backward. His hand flailed in the air as he pulled it away. The pain wasn't horrible, but he just hadn't been expecting it. He stared at the chains for a second more and decided that brute force wasn't the right choice. Priscilla, any suggestions? I believe you should try and shrink or alter it as a whole. Remember what you did with the marks. Mash nodded and was about to try it when he was suddenly forced to return to his body. Mash jolted forward, pain surging through his thigh. Mash's head had been down, and he saw red staining the ground. It took a second to realize that he had been stabbed. A knife dug into his thigh and blood leaked out from the side. The red was noticeable as it contrasted with his paler skin. It slowly pooled around his naked leg, and he frowned. They had taken his clothes from him. He could feel his clothes were nearby. His bond to them let him know their location. Sorry, did I wake you? Mash debated between keeping silent or responding. He decided that responding would be the more fun choice. These people hadn't killed him yet, and he doubted that would change from a little word. Yes, and after all the effort I went through to hide from your ugly face. The other man punched him. It wasn't a particularly hard punch. Even at his best, the ugly man couldn't really hurt Mash. That didn't stop him from commenting afterward. Says the monster. Wait, you're telling me you're human? Man, you can't be. Another punch interrupted his quick response. It was too late, Mash got the punchline out. The added jab was a little childish, but he grinned either way. The man realized that his punches weren't doing much and instead grabbed the knife. He turned it, which elicited a grunt of pain from Mash. The knife was carved into his flesh, and the man wasn't strong enough to do it quickly. It slowly tore apart his flesh. Mash glared at the man but kept quiet. He couldn't be like Jill. The satisfaction would only be temporary, and he needed to focus on the seal. Hey boss, I think he has some weird skill with his eyes. We should remove them, just in case. The ugly man had an ugly smirk on his face. Mash briefly debated rising to the bait and decided he couldn't leave it alone. Please, literally anything is better than your face. Mash didn't have to say it, but he felt like Jill would demand nothing less. There was always a time for the snark. The ugly man's face reddened slightly, and he tried to rise to his feet. His arm banged into one of the walls as he tried to reach for his sword. That was when another voice joined the conversation. Stop. If you care about his comments, then leave this duty to another. The voice came from behind one of the walls, and the speaker hesitated a little before saying another. They were probably going to say a specific name, and he wished they hadn't realized. He still didn't know any of their names. The ugly man froze and returned to his position against the opposite wall. Some sweat slowly rolled down the man's forehead. The reproach he received had terrified the man. Mash probably could have made another stupid comment but decided to refocus on the chains. His vision blurred and changed. He stood in front of the dark star again. The chains hadn't changed in the slightest. Priscilla informed him that his brother was a day away. These people were heading to the south of the kingdom and had teleported most of the distance. He had just informed Priscilla that he was going to find Jill and come with her. Mash didn't bother responding. He left Priscilla to keep his brother updated on the situation. The news did make him refocus on the chains. He wanted to get out himself. He needed to do it. Mash thought about the seal like one of the marks from before. When he did that, he could tell how much weaker it was. It had stopped his skills, but that was it. It couldn't do anything else, and that realization made it feel small. He tried shrinking the thing like before and found that he could. The effects didn't seem to diminish, but it looked a lot smaller now. He continued to shrink it. It wasn't even difficult. After a few seconds, he managed to carry the whole thing in a single hand. Mission accomplished? The thought passed quickly. No, the seal wasn't gone, and he still didn't have access to his skills. Mash frowned and looked for Priscilla. Nothing happened. It just got smaller. Yes, but now you can break it. There was certainty behind Priscilla's message, and he smiled. He reached for the chain and paused. It would hurt. The sensation from earlier still lingered on his finger. He also bet that the people outside would know if he broke the seal. The hesitation gave him the needed time to think. He would need to attack as soon as the seal broke. Utilize his skills and kill the man in the carriage. His priorities would be turning to dragon form and discharging some lightning. The ugly man would die to a kick from his dragon form or from the lightning. Then he would use reconstruction to restore his arms. It might not be enough for both, but he could probably recover one at least. The plan was gruesome, but he decided to stick to it. Chapter 255, Seal Breaking. Mash grabbed the shrunken seal. Pain spread from his palm as it touched his skin. The dark light it radiated seemed to be mixing with his skin, infecting it like one of Red's attacks. Mash's teeth hurt as he ground them together. The mass of chains might feel more like a ball of knives, one which could easily pierce his skin. He pushed through the pain and squeezed his hand closed. The slicing pain changed into a burning one, and it grew increasingly more severe. The pain didn't stop him. He knew that if he stopped, he would need to restart. There was only one thing he could do. The pain spread quickly, and before long it felt like his whole body was wrapped in the chains. The more he squeezed, the tighter the chains on him were getting. It felt like he was tearing the chains off, and they pressed into him as he did so. They dug into his flesh and passed through them. Minutes passed as he suffered through the pain. The chains felt like they slowly cut through his body. Eventually, the chains in his hand broke, and then he caused chaos. It had felt like he had literally pulled the chains out of his body. He grunted internally but moved quickly. Lightning exploded from his body and consumed the room he was in with a blinding light. The ugly man hadn't been prepared, and the lightning struck and blinded him. It didn't kill him, but Mash's headbutt did the job. Draconic scales had covered his body, and his forehead had smashed the other man's head like a ripe fruit. Mash didn't pause or hesitate. He pressed his body against the now dead man and used chimeric reconstruction. The man's body melted, his flesh dissolved, and flowed into Mash's body. The other man's bones and organs had similarly been deconstructed. Mash wanted to vomit at the sight but held his tongue. The wounds on his body had healed, and both of his arms regrew. It barely took a minute to heal, but the image was scarred into his mind. Both because of what happened with his arm and the man. Mash watched in fascination as the human simply vanished. His whole body was gone, and all that remained was his armor and clothing. On the other hand, his arms sprouted from stumps on his shoulder. The partially formed layer of skin that had grown as he healed, tore away, and his body rebuilt itself from the inside out. He was able physically to see his bones and nerves reform before the rest of the flesh and muscle hid them away. There was a moment where he could move an oddly skeletal hand, though it was quickly covered in a brand new layer of flesh and skin. That was an experience he didn't want to go through again. Losing a limb wasn't all that bad. Other than the pain and slight discomfort, his mind had accepted the injury pretty quickly. Maybe Priscilla had a hand in helping him, but he bet his new race also had some involvement. A brief thought of his skills made him think it was Chimera's constitution. Mash didn't really feel guilty either. This was one person that had deserved what he got. The next course of action was to retrieve his clothing. Escape would probably be the biggest priority for most other people in this situation, but he had his skills now. He had transformed into his dragon form, and that meant that he was a lot stronger now. The fight with the ugly man and the rest had been hard, but that was because he didn't have his skills. As soon as he got them back, the ugly man had died to a single attack. It hadn't even been a challenge. He knew that none of these people would be a challenge anymore. Even the leader with his legendary weapon wouldn't be able to do anything. None of that was important though. Everything else felt insignificant as he got his domain back. It was like he had lost his vision and just managed to regain it. It was a liberating feeling and one that revealed his surroundings to him. He was stunned by the location. The shaking and bumps he had noticed were from crashing waves, not occasional stones. They had gotten him on a boat. There was 1 floor above him and 2 below. The ship was too wide for him to see the edges, but he could glimpse onto the deck. There was movement all around him. Just where were they planning on taking him? Their home, no doubt, but where was that? He was tempted to go and find another of the knights but decided fleeing was a better plan. His clothes first, and he could tell that several people were aware of the situation. Lightning was loud and his attack had started a commotion. Within his domain, he could see dozens of people running around. Some were high level too. He expected the seals to hit him again and thought that he didn't have much time. He decided that a fight would be least beneficial to him at the moment. He could probably win, but there was no reason to take the risk again. Mash recognized something as he thought. He was calm, unusually so. In fact, he had been calm the entire time. Even when he had been fighting the first time, he knew that he had been calm. He hadn't been worried about dying. Now, he wondered where his certainty had come from. Priscilla. He checked with her, but he was already moving. He could tell where his robes were and wanted to grab them before leaving. Although, he altered his transformation immediately as well. He grew wings to fly away once he got his robes. He altered his muscles to make him stronger, and he radiated an aura of anti-magic. He was surprised by his own calmness, and how fast he was able to come up with a plan. Perhaps it is your new race? Maybe it altered your thought processes. Improved them as it had done with the rest of your body. Mash didn't know if he feared the idea or liked it, but it seemed like Chimera's constitution was a weird skill. It probably also meant that his body was still changing. He knew that it was taking a while to change, but he didn't think such big changes would happen. This wasn't the same as the class's influence or the unnatural alteration of his skills. It was more like his way of thinking was what had changed. His beliefs and thoughts were the same, but the way his mind juggled various thoughts was different. One was that he was able to focus on more things at once. He looked down, locating his robes near the base of the boat. Mash could tell that people were about to enter the room. He bet that one of them would try and seal his skills again. He wouldn't give them that opportunity though. Mash aimed down through the boat and lifted for the ground a little. He jumped, the wood bent a little as he did so. The boat wasn't that durable. The small motion was just the start though. He turned in the air so that his feet would strike the ceiling. The room was small, but he still managed to a full flip. His bare feet struck the wooden roof of the building, and he kicked off of it with all of his strength. The wood exploded outward, escaping into the room above. He shot through the boat, barely even being slowed by the wood. He didn't even bother shielding his face and crashed through wooden floors head first. He didn't slow as he passed by where his clothes were. He simply held out his hand and grabbed them through the chest they were in. His hand easily destroyed the furniture. Splinters of wood flew about, but he ignored them. Then he broke through the bottom of the ship and hit the cold water of the sea. It was his first time here, and he was surprised by how cold the water was. From what others had said, he expected the water to be warmer. The taste of salt filled his mouth, and his eyes stung a little. He had heard that sea water was salty, and he didn't like it very much. He turned in the water for a second, trying his best to put his clothes on. There was an argument to be made that he shouldn't care about nakedness at the moment, but he knew that Jill would be here any second now. He did not want to be naked when the others arrived. It was a relatively small concern, all things considered, but it only took a few seconds to put on his clothes. The water made it a little bit more challenging. Once he was mostly dressed, he shifted until he was aimed toward Priscilla's imitations. While turning, he stopped and stared around the ocean. It got dark quickly, but there was more life to the sea than he expected. Small fishes filled the ocean. They were small and white and glowed faintly with a gentle light. They swarmed around, but they gave him a wide berth as they swam. He was momentarily stunned by the sight and just stared in fascination at the creatures. They filled the water thickly, reminding him oddly of porridge. A porridge with rice like the ones people have when they get sick. He stared at the countless number of fishes. Oddly, he didn't even feel the slightest temptation to eat them. The sight was too amazing for that, and he would have stayed longer if not for the sudden need for air. He could probably transform to have gills but decided he was just wasting time. Mash used his wings to fly out of the water. He moved fast enough to catch some fish in his trail. They briefly flopped out of the water, but quickly vanished as they fell back in. He looked back at the boat and considered doing more damage to it briefly. The revenge would probably feel good, and he debated what to do. The urge to just attack wildly was worth it, but he held himself back. He had to make sure to tell his brother, so it wouldn't really be responsible. I have informed him already. Oh, good call. Priscilla might be a little too open about sharing his situation. It was probably for the best, so he left it alone. Instead, he followed up with another question. He was just a little bit too annoyed to abandon his revenge. How long till he gets to Jill? 2 minutes at most. Mash had been trapped for a while, hadn't he? Hearing that his brother was coming soon was freeing, but he wondered why it took so long. Had something else happened? He was vaguely worried but guessed that he would find out soon enough. He made a mental note to give Jill a body of Priscilla next. He had avoided giving it to the others since they were usually together, but that was dumb. Jill absolutely needed one, and she could just teleport to anyone else. He glanced down at the ship and saw several people rising to the deck. 2 minutes was more than enough time for his revenge. He slowly moved his hand and aimed it at the ship. Lightning danced between his fingertips, and he let it build and build. He was in his dragon form, and the one thing it gave in excess was power. Mash opened to his palm toward the ship and lightning lanced out at the ship, raining down on the deck in several thick bolts. The light was blinding, and the sound could only be described as thunderous. His magic roared with anger, but he didn't really feel much anger himself. The fight had started. Chapter 256, Sinking. The lightning struck the deck and damaged or destroyed the places it impacted. The ship's flag thing broke and fell toward the sailing on the right side. He knew that there were some special terms used for ship parts and places, but his knowledge went only to the words deck, and poop deck. The lightning wasn't aimed at any of the knights, but that was because he hadn't really aimed at anything in particular. That didn't stop it from being drawn to some of their metal equipment. One of the knights was struck as they were coming up onto the deck. Their whole body lit up from the lightning. The armor melted in some places and Mash felt the rush of a level up. He winced a little. He hadn't meant to kill him, but he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. His brother had told him not to charge into fights, but if he found himself in one to hold nothing back. Those were words of wisdom, and ones he should have been following. He would follow them now. His dragon form empowered him and filled him with confidence. Below, there were plenty of enemies who deserved a taste of its power. The man with a legendary weapon was on the deck, and Mash could see him wielding the invisible weapon. Well, he couldn't see it, but the man had taken a stance like he was wielding it. Mash dove down. He descended like a falling meteor and grew wood out of his body to make the impact more significant. These knights didn't seem to have flight skills. That made sense considering that they were traveling by boat. With that in mind, Mash didn't aim for the deck or the knights, and instead crashed into the side of the ship opposite to them. When he crashed into the ship, he was a mess of wooden limbs and points. Like a flung boulder, he tore through the side of the boat. The wooden boat barely resisted the impact and he destroyed almost a third of the ship. The wood began falling into the ocean, and Mash joined it in the water. He separated from the wooden creation. It would sink to the bottom. Some of the planks of wood were floating to the top, but large sections of the ship along with his creation were too heavy for that. The fish were in a panic, some had died to his lightning, and many were swimming in random directions. Mash grew a wooden spear in his hand and thrust it at some of the fish. The spear changed as the fish's blood began leaking into the water. The spear changed, wooden mouths grew along with the weapon and started eating the skewered fish. The ship was sinking, though he could tell that someone was slowing its fall. The wood was regrowing. Wood magic was rare, but Mash didn't hold any exclusive right over it. It didn't seem like whoever was doing it had the ability to control the wood remotely. Mash wondered how rare that skill was. Even he didn't have direct control of wood. Mash only considered the thought briefly. He was going to bring that ship down, regardless of what the other mage tried. Mash rarely used his thunderwood imitation other than for making clones of Priscilla, but there was something else he could do now. He imagined a sea dragon or the depictions of them he had seen in a children's books. This was not a true imitation but something he was making by mixing his forms. The fish he had just eaten plus the dragon form should make for good models. Wood started growing around his body. Layers of scales spread on his body. Some of the scales were sharp and angular like the dragon form, but others were softer and circular. The wood continued to billow out from his body, slowly taking the shape he had envisioned. He ended up forming a serpentine creature that was closer to a fish than a dragon. The major difference was that it had an extremely long and spiny tail. Mash wasn't a sea dragon, but he was a sea monster. Plus, he was growing at an incredible rate. Within a few seconds, he was more than big enough to bring the ship down. That was exactly what he wanted to do. Mash turned, only finding it a little awkward to move like a fish. Well, he was more like a serpent, but one that could swim. There was one other difference. He had wings instead of fins. They had grown with the rest of his body, and each was easily as big as the ship's deck. The wind affinity helped him carry his enormous form, and he felt his energy drain rapidly. He erupted from the water. The serpentine body was already a little longer than the ship itself. He got a good look at the people on the boat as he turned to crash into it. The people on board were trying desperately to stop the boat from sinking. Mash noticed some of the people were casting off their armor. That included the man with the legendary weapon. They had seen him come from the water, and even if they only had a few seconds, the most skilled of the group were reacting. The others simply stared, stunned by Mash's transformation. They had seen him dive into the water as a wooden comet, and now he was a dragon. Mash couldn't help but let out a theatrical roar, as he turned and dove toward the ship. He kept growing larger. Several of the people on the boat were fleeing now. The bigger issue was the ones that weren't. They would probably all die, and Mash felt their deaths already starting to weigh on his mind. Even with the form of a dragon, even if he wouldn't turn away now, he would accept the guilt. Something in that thought felt right. Ignoring the guilt didn't work, and neither did letting it consume. He didn't need to choose either path, did he? He could accept the consequences of his actions. Their deaths would weigh on him as did all the others, but he didn't need to make more or less of it. Resolved, he crashed into the ship. There was more resistance this time. The other wood mage was probably trying to stop him. It wasn't enough as he coiled around the ship and hit it. His spiked tail dug into the boat's bottom and sides. Mash could feel water surging around his body, and also felt the rush of a level up. Mash dragged the ship downwards, turning the entire thing as he re-entered the sea. The waves he made were immense. The ship slowly tilted to its side, then turned completely upside down as he forced it into the water. Mash felt something strike his side, and his vision broke again. This time he was more familiar with the effect, and the breaking of his vision didn't bother him too much. His domain extended from his body, and that included when he transformed. He could see the man who had struck him and watched as he skids along the deck of the ship as Mash turned the boat. Some had been smart enough to jump into the water themselves, but others had remained on the deck. Mash untangled himself from the boat. His spikes tore the boat apart as he released himself. It sunk to the bottom, not that he could actually see that far down. Even as the ship fell apart, Mash felt around for his targets. There were many people in the water and some others were still escaping from the ship. Mash swatted at them with his tail and wings. The first target was the man with the hammer. The man in question was trying to surface. Mash could see him. After striking Mash's side, he might have thought that he wasn't able to do any real damage. It was a nice trick of the skill. He took damage through the transformation, and secondary effects like the breaking thing the hammer did still affect him. Luckily, there was no way for the man to know that. Even if the man's strike had cracked or damaged the wood, Mash was able to act like it hadn't done anything. Mash had to turn his whole body downward to bring his tail up. He swung it and snapped it like a whip at the man. Mash was impressed to see the man had raised his hands in a defensive posture. The tail came down swishing through the water. It bent as it struck him and sent him downward. The water seemed to chase him as he moved quickly through the water. Most people would never fight in the water. Items and skills designed for it were surprisingly rare. All the people around Mash were trying to surface for air. He let some by but struck at the strongest of them. Although some of that was just guessing. He splashed through the water, sending people crashing as he swam toward his next target. Jill P.O.V. Jill sat on a too comfortable couch. The couch was so big that her feet struggled to touch the ground. She was never tall, and her advancements had actually shrunk her a little. It wasn't anything crazy, but she had lost almost 2 inches when she got to the fairy class. She fidgeted on the couch, and her fingernails scraped the regal red cushions. Still uncomfortable, she moved her hands away from the cushions. The couch was probably expensive, and she didn't want to tear the cloth. So, she reached for the coffee table that was in front of the couch. It was covered in small plates and cups. A dozen different snacks and drinks adorned the fancy table. The table was made of redwood and comically fit in the almost completely red house. She grabbed a teacup, one that was still releasing a little bit of heat. Even the teacups were magically enchanted to maintain a perfect temperature in the drinks. She wished they would have had something cheaper like juice or even milk. The fancy tea, in the even fancier teacups, was somewhat overwhelming. A shiver ran down her spine, despite the warm cup in her hand. She constantly felt like someone was watching her and would bet money on that being true. Jill glanced over her shoulder while taking a sip of the tea. She couldn't really taste it. There was nothing behind her other than a single red door. Once she left, she would spend an hour or two just staring at the grass or sky. Anything that wasn't red would work perfectly. Jill heard a knock on the door and hoped desperately that Red had returned. It wasn't her, and she should have known it. Red wouldn't have bothered knocking. A maid walked in and replaced some of the plates of snacks that Jill had eaten. The servant proceeded to ask Jill if there was anything that she needed. Jill shook her head but decided to ask about Red. She had been gone for almost an hour now. Is Red almost done? Jill couldn't hide the desperation in her voice. This place was suffocating, to say the least. Mana filled the environment like a toxic gas, and it was overstuffed with the smell of roses. The awe from her initial encounter had died over the last hour. Now she was sick of the commitment to the color red. She wished that she had gone to do something else, imagined fighting in the Frostlands to the north. That would be a million times better than this. The maid who had come in hadn't left yet, which was a first. Jill glanced toward the maid who was wearing a red dress, though one that was stylized to match the typical attire of servants. Jill was about to ask what she was doing but paused upon hearing another knock at the door. Chapter 257, Overbearing. Jill P.O.V. The knock seemed superficial as someone entered without waiting for a response. Jill was surprised to see someone without red hair. Everyone, including the maids, had red hair. She almost thought the person was an intruder if not for the obvious resemblance to Red. The woman had short oddly green hair, and pointed ears protruded from curls. While she did seem somewhat similar to Red, she was way more beautiful. That thought might have been rude, but this woman was the kind person all girls wanted to look like. Elves were naturally fair-skinned and slender, but the lady in front of Jill was the prime example of those features. Red's mom was gorgeous. Despite her staring, Jill was not slow to react. She placed the teacup back on the table and rose to her feet quickly. She had learned of a lot of different noble traditions from her father, but she didn't know exactly how to treat an elf. She settled for the most common address. She tilted her head down slightly and introduced herself clearly. Hello, I am Jill. Jill managed to speak properly but was still absorbed by the woman's beauty. She wore a simple red dress. It seemed like a long single piece of silk that had been wrapped around her body. She fitted perfectly. Red had said that her mother's class made her sickly, but Jill didn't see any evidence of that. Ah, please sit down, dear. Any friend of my daughter is always welcome here. Red's mother was something else. Her voice was perfect. It wasn't deep but it wasn't girly either. There was a breathiness to it that made it mature, and Jill expected that she would never become like that. Her own mother was more of the gruff type, although she wasn't really following in her footsteps either. Jill followed the instructions and sat back down. This time she didn't slump into the couch but tried to match the other woman's posture. She kept her back straight and leaned forward a little bit. However, she knew that her posture was a poor imitation of Red's mother. Red's mother had pushed her dress out a little before sitting. The dress went all the way to her feet, and she had to move it slightly to sit without wrinkling it. She made even that gesture graceful. Thank you. Where is Red and what did you want to talk about? Jill spoke clearly. Red had said that her mother was kind, so Jill thought it would be okay to act a bit more comfortable. Even with the friendly nature of Red's mother, Jill still felt a little awkward in the house. Red's mother smiled pleasantly as she responded. I just wanted to hear how Red, was doing. And I know you have a few young men in your group. Red's mother didn't ask any questions directly, but Jill got an idea of what she wanted to know. Jill didn't miss the nickname either and imagined that Red would hate it. She would start using it. Jill didn't immediately answer the question and considered what the Red's mother was hoping to hear. What was she hoping for? Jill gave up trying to read the woman. Her expression was too natural to glean anything from it. So, Jill decided to shift her way of thinking to Red. What did she actually think of the others? Were there any romantic feelings there? She didn't think so. Every interaction Jill could remember involved Red acting far more responsibly than the rest of them. She made mistakes, sure, but she was usually the voice of reason. Honestly, both Mash and Luke seemed too childish for her. Jill shook her head and responded. We are all just friends. Well, maybe more like a family at this point. The conversation stretched for a little bit. It became a back and forth where Jill spent most of the time answering questions about Red. She did wonder where Red was, but she never got a succinct answer. Red's mother kept talking about her daughter's location but said that she was taking a nap. Jill had never seen Red take a nap of any kind. She wasn't really all that worried though. For all Red disliked most of her family, her mother seemed to be the exception. The conversation took a sharp turn at some point. It happened when one of the maids suggested that Red would arrive soon. Well, Jill, it has been wonderful speaking with you, but I do have one more thing I must request of you. Jill was surprised by the sudden urgency in the woman's voice. Jill met eyes with the woman and saw the desperation in her gaze. Her eyes widened slightly like a puppy. Jill hesitated and responded carefully. What? I want you to take this and record Eli. Red's mother was excited and held a magical item out for Jill. She recognized the item instantly. Jill's own mother had made one of these. It was a recording device that could capture images. The gem alone would do that though, the bracelet itself wasn't necessary. She guessed that there was a secondary effect to the item like transmission. It seemed excessive and overbearing. Jill raised her gaze from the item back to Red's mother. Her gaze was filled with hope and desperation in a way that Jill could only describe as overbearing. You should probably just ask Eli. I don't think. I'll give you 10 no 20,000 gold pieces. Jill coughed a little as Red's mother offered a ridiculous price. It did make Jill reconsider the situation. Red wouldn't mind a couple of pictures, right? It was a lot of gold, and he could give some of it to Red too. Red's mother was so caring too, it would only be right. It was fine for a mother to be a little overbearing. Jill was about to accept, but something interrupted her. It took a second for her to recognize what, but then she heard shouting. Jill! Mash is in trouble! Jill sprang to her feet. She saw the surprise on Red's mother's face, and Jill contemplated what to do. Mash being in trouble wasn't really all that unexpected. Honestly, she wasn't even really worried. He would probably be fine, though she should go and deal with it. Jill grabbed the bracelet but made no promises. I will just use this to take whatever pictures I want, and Red will be in some of them. If you're fine with that, I will do it. Red's mother smiled as the shouting outside continued. That would be perfect. I wanted nothing more than to keep an eye on my daughter. I do think you should go meet with this new guest. The look Red's mother had was heavy. There was so much eagerness behind her gaze that Jill felt a little bad for her. The gaze of a mother was truly overbearing. As Jill started walking towards the door, she shivered as the air grew significantly colder. That wasn't Luke, was it? She sighed. She was just going from one overbearing family member to another. Jill rushed through the hallway and exited the building quickly. Red was already outside, and she joined her. Arthur was indeed the one who had shouted. It was the first time she had ever heard the man raise his voice above a calm tone. Even now he was talking loudly, but his voice was oddly calm. Oddly, he didn't sound as urgent as she would have expected. That first shout had been far louder and more urgent than the subsequent ones. Hello, Jill. Mash has been kidnapped and you are the only one who can teleport directly to him. Arthur spoke without even the slightest worry in his voice anymore. It was so flat that it made her wonder if there was any actual danger. She had to ask. How, who? She couldn't even comprehend who or what could capture someone like Mash. Everything he did was large and explosive. Mash wasn't the kind of person that got kidnapped. Killed was one thing, but who would go out of their way to kidnap him? I do not know, but we should go. Arthur responded with cold indifference, but he obviously cared. Jill nodded and then imagined teleporting to wherever Mash was. Time to find out who had managed to kidnap him. Mash P.O.V. Mash thrashed about in the water. He was taking hits from every conceivable direction. However, the water was helping him out at the moment. The others were struggling to generate any real force, and the hammer man was still trying to swim back to the surface. Mash had gotten used to his friends all having an ability to fly and forgot that it was actually on the rarer side as far skills went. His tail slapped into two different people at once. Both were quick enough to point their blades toward him. They struck his wooden tail and easily stuck it into them. It was a good attack all things considered. Although he was too large for something like that to be seriously effective. Ironically, they were like splinters to him. Mash twirled in the water, smacking people about. Some were just struggling with the current his movements were made. The people were all close and most were losing the will to fight. Most were just attempting to run away at this point. The man with the hammer was lost in the water, and Mash hadn't seen him again. Mash felt the rush of another level up. He didn't even know how many people had been in the boat, and how many would die from his thrashing. He saw several projectiles headed toward him. Some were metal, but others were made of rocks and ice. Mash opened his wings out and pushed the water aside. The sheer weight of the water he pushed was enough to stop most of the projectiles. Mash truly felt like a dragon now. His body was that of an enormous beast, and each of his movements caused the whole sea to stir. A swipe of his tail could easily affect everyone in the water. A beat of his wing would cause enormous waves to rise from the surface. He was getting into the fight, relishing in the great power he was able to explore. The sea was the perfect place to let out all of the power he would need to restrain normally. Mash turned his gaze to the remaining people. He didn't know how many had died or fled, but the ones that were remaining weren't giving up. They struggled against him, some even abandoned any hope of escape. The remaining fighters would die, and Mash would be the one to do it. He didn't know how he felt about that. They were going to fight to the death. The people before him were resolved for that much. Mash met that resolve head on. He would not hold back. His brother's advice still hung in his head, and Mash prepared to release a blast of lightning. He aimed toward the densest pack of people. Some of whom were continuing to throw or launch projectiles at Mash. They weren't very strong. Without his skills being sealed, he could grasp just how big the difference was. He bet that most weren't even level 100. Mash opened his mouth, and water rushed in. He could feel through his wooden body, but thankfully that didn't include taste. He was glad to avoid the feeling of a mouthful of salt in his mouth. The water began filling his mouth but only lasted for a second. A burst of lightning flew out of his mouth. It didn't travel the way he intended it to. It dispersed quickly, filling the water around him blindly. That would be fine if that was all it did. His resistance would make the damage minimal. Although, it did more than just that. It heated the water quickly, and within a few seconds, the water around him was boiling. He felt it too. The bubbling and burning water stung. It was like it danced across his own skin. If that was happening to him, he could only imagine what the unprotected people were going through. Chapter 258, Hot and Cold. The boiling water was hot, and Mash felt the rush of another level up. He hadn't intended on hitting such a wide area. He had only wanted to disrupt the biggest group, not cook everyone alive. It was a more horrific way to die than they deserved. Mash felt something within his domain. The mana was acting strangely, but it was familiar. The water shifted oddly as if it were pushed out of the way by something. An instant later, Jill and Arthur were thrust into the water. The still boiling water. The water is boiling. Mash yelled the words. He could still speak despite the wooden form he had taken. His voice didn't carry the same way in the water, though he was surprised to hear it work. The words came out deeper and louder than he had ever done before. His warning was unneeded. They noticed the water before his words could get to them. His brother's blade formed in his hand and the boiling water was no longer bubbling. As soon as the blade formed, the water stopped boiling. The warmth was swallowed by the blade and Mash felt colder. Arthur swung his sword in a wide enveloping strike. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, and Mash watched as everything froze. The water started freezing, and Arthur stood at the epicenter of it. The ice grew from his brother and perfectly froze everything in place. The ice continued to grow until it completely trapped Mash and everyone within the ocean. Only a few people had worked through the initial surprise and tried to flee from the ice. It didn't work and everyone ended up trapped in a glacier. Mash could still see his brother. The ice was surprisingly clear, and Arthur was well within his domain. The ice didn't seem to impede his brother at all. He seemed to move it and expanded the space around him until he could breathe freely. Arthur walked over and dug Jill and Red out of the ice too and gave them ample space to move as well. Once the two were free, they teleported away. Mash assumed they had simply gone to the top of the new glacier. Arthur turned to Mash and spoke. With his brother's unchanging expression, Mash struggled to understand what he had said. His voice didn't carry through the glacier. Arthur walked over slowly and calmly. None of the other people could even move. His brother didn't rush, but Mash thought that he was angry. Even though Mash couldn't hear his brother's words, there was something about his casualness that made him seem angrier to Mash. The ice around Mash began to shift as Arthur got closer. The ice around him slowly started to dissolve, and Mash was able to move soon. He could have destroyed the ice with magic or a skill but decided against it. Now that the ice was weakening, Mash took that as permission. He moved the wood and separated himself from the imitation. Mash walked out of the wooden construct and let his transformation drop. It was at that moment that he received the consequences of his creation. He collapsed onto the ice and just lay there with his face pressed against the cold ice. Hunt had triggered at some point, and he collapsed to the ground now that it was over. He shifted his head upward and rested his chin against the floor as his brother approached. The ice sent a chill through his jaw, and his words came out a little forced. "Hey Arthur!" Perfect timing. Mash didn't yell the words, but they echoed loudly in the icy caverns. His breath was visible in the cold temperature. His brother hadn't held back at all, had he? It was so cold that even Mash could feel it. The normal people would end up with frostbite or worse. Mash couldn't help but stare in fascination at the frozen sea. Animals and people were frozen in place. The ice was so pure and clean that it felt like time itself had frozen. He had meant the words as a joke, but his brother didn't take it as one. "I'm sorry, I should have been there. Don't worry, I won't let any of them get away." Arthur was definitely angry, but it seemed like it was mostly directed inward. Mash wasn't the best at reading people, but his family was an exception to that. Even if he hadn't spent all that much time together, there was this connection between him and his family. That had always been there, and now his domain let him get a small glimpse into their emotions too. He needed to stop his brother from doing anything hasty. "Wait, it's not your fault. And I'm fine." "Yes, I know. We will still need to capture everyone we can and find out the exact situation. Priscilla told me a lot, but I still need to hear some things from you." His brother's emotions hadn't changed, but he wasn't doing anything hasty either. Mash forgot, his brother wasn't as prone to making rash decisions as he was. His brother didn't leave immediately but occasionally sent his mana out into the ice. Mash was a little curious about what Arthur was doing. His brother noticed and explained. He could tell when someone was trying to break out or escape, and he was just reinforcing the ice to keep them trapped. They talked for a little bit. Mash explained some skills and about how many people he had seen. He told Arthur of the one who had the throne breaker. They only talked for a minute or two. Just enough time for Mash to recover enough to get out of the ice. His brother carved him a staircase out of the glacier, and Mash happily escaped from the prison of ice. It took over a minute to walk out of the glacier. Once he approached the top of the glacier, the chill of the ice started to lessen. It was coldest around his brother. The final step carried him onto the glacier, and Mash looked around in awe. The glacier stretched beyond the limits of his vision. It was almost like his brother had frozen the entire sea. Mash didn't that was possible, even with a legendary weapon. Not all weapons were equal, but that still sounded like an impossible feat. The glacier was still enormous. The waves had frozen and made the sea's surface of the water seem like the back of a monster. Mash slowly spun, taking in the incredible sight. He spotted Jill and Red but didn't stop his spin. He just kept spinning, and only stopped after 2 more revolutions. After the first one, Jill and Red teleport beside Mash. It didn't stop him, and he did 1 more revolution. The frozen landscape was truly an amazing sight. The casual display of power reminded him of himself. It seemed like Arthur enjoyed showing off just as much as Mash did. Although he probably wouldn't admit it. "How are you?" Mash was a little startled as Jill grabbed his shoulders. She spoke after meeting eyes with him. There was some worry in her voice, but Mash felt fine. He shrugged his shoulders and replied easily. "I'm fine." The words came easily. It was the truth after all. "Arthur said you were tortured. Are you really, okay?" Mash had spoken honestly, but the calmness he felt probably came off as forced or unnatural to her. There was no false bravado at all. He was genuine. This whole incident, everything felt kind of small to him now. The deaths would weigh on him, but he didn't care all that much for what had been done to him. That was strange. In the past, he would have been angrier and wanted vengeance or something. Now, he just wanted to head back and go to the Frostlands up north. He sat back on the ground and began using inhuman hibernation to recover. It felt slow compared to his chimeric reconstruction. Although, he didn't think he would use it on other people unless he needed to. His skill had left nothing behind. It turned a person into nothing. It was much more extreme than he could have expected. He tried to stop thinking about it and responded to Jill. "I'm fine. It's not like physical wounds really matter. I can heal them in a few seconds. Plus, I had Priscilla with me the whole time." He was never really scared of the constant updates from Priscilla. Not to mention he had been fairly distracted by the seal. Breaking it had taken a while and drew all of his focus. It helped push away any other thoughts or worries. Even without that, he wasn't really concerned about torture. He had a high tolerance for pain. The memory of his missing arms was just another injury. One of many, and he was certain to receive worse. Jill looked hesitant, but Red changed the subject. "How many levels did you get?" "Right." She had reminded him to check his status. He didn't know how or why he kept forgetting to do that, but it really did happen far too often. Most people treated their status as the most important thing in their lives. It was just as important to Mash, but he just forgot to check it. That didn't make sense to him either, but he just sighed and focused inward. Name, Mash Stel Lumbra. Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 108-112. Health, 3300/3300. Energy, 4400/4400. Fortitude, 330. Endurance, 210. Strength, 275. Agility, 275. Intelligence, 230. Wisdom, 120. Charisma, 110. Free stats, 040. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Chimeric Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Chimeric Reconstruction, Vagabond's Path, Chimeric Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Chimera's Constitution, Wooden Body, Mimics Avarice, A Touch of Nothingness, Golden Body. Golden Body, passive. Having stolen the techniques of another world, your body evolves beyond its old limitations. However, even this transformation is incomplete. Seek out the next step and truly make this power your own. Trial of the True Body, 2527/100. Mash had gained more levels than he expected. 4 levels felt like a lot considering how weak the other people had been. Even the strongest of them were probably lowered level than him. The bonus to his leveling speed seemed to apply to people as well. That was a bad thing, and he wondered if others had figured that out too. He remembered his brother's warnings. Arthur had said that people might hunt Mash and his friends, and this might be the reason why. Being above level 100 could make him more desirable to some, but it would probably be a deterrent for most. If people were gaining levels more easily, then that would explain the increased demand for level 100s. More people were getting to the threshold and needed ways to overcome the wall. Mash shook himself out of his thinking as his focus drifted away from status. "I gained 4 levels. Plus, I progressed my golden body. I think the reconstruction skills work for that." He left it at that, and Red nodded her head. Jill whistled softly, impressed by the gains. Mash felt similarly. It was way more than he deserved for the fight. With all of the fighting he was hoping for some stats, but there was nothing. It was a bit of a disappointment, but he could understand why. Neither fight had pushed him, or rather, he didn't push himself in either fight. The first he had been arrogant, and he had fought poorly. The second time, he had won easily, by overpowering the people with raw power. Neither fight had been enough to strengthen his stats or push his boundaries. He should try and challenge himself more like he did with the wolves. Chapter 259, Invitations. Arthur captured nearly all of the remaining fighters easily. The person with the hammer was nowhere to be found, but he could have easily died and sunk to the bottom. The dead were plentiful, and many had fallen into the depths. The oceans were deep, and Mash had heard of the dangers that lurked beyond where the light touched. Just like the skies, it would be somewhere to explore when he was stronger. There were few places like that. Places that promised untold challenge and treasure. Arthur returned to the surface with a dozen people in tow. The people didn't try to fight back as they had with Mash. Although the ice encrusting their body probably frightened them into line. "Are you all ready to return? I must speak with the king." He also wanted to speak with Mash if I remember correctly. Mash looked at his brother. He had forgotten about the king's request entirely. Jill looked over at the people and shook her head. I can't take them all in one trip. That was fair. It would take quite a lot of mana to teleport so many people such a great distance. He could tell that he was far from the capital. Honestly, he was probably closer to the other continent at this point. Maybe he should visit? It could be fun, plus there were probably different dungeons and monsters there. He looked eastward, and Arthur noticed. No. You can't seriously be considering it. You just helped kill or contain their soldiers, and it sounds like you killed a hero. Arthur was obviously right, but that didn't mean that Mash would agree blindly. Visiting the other continents was an interesting prospect. He doubted that it would be much of a problem if he went with the others. This was a good opportunity, but Luke wasn't there. He did have another idea though and had Priscilla send a message to Jill. Put a mark here. If she did that, they could return whenever they wanted. It would literally happen within the blink of an eye. Jill gave Mash an imperceptible nod, that he was only able to notice because of his domain. The ocean hadn't been a cold place before, but now it was cold enough to be uncomfortable. Arthur spoke. Can you take multiple trips, Jill? The kingdom would reimburse you like another teleporter. She nodded and discussed some details about the costs with Arthur. Mash knew that group teleportation skills were rare and expensive. People could buy it, but it was usually only a luxury used by nobles or knights. Jill ended up getting his brother up to over 100 gold pieces for the teleports. It didn't seem like Jill was planning on offering any discounts to a friend. Although the expense didn't seem like much of a concern to his brother. After the plan was ironed out, Jill teleported half of the prisoners along with himself to the capital. Ma glanced around. He didn't immediately recognize his surroundings, but his domain helped him calm down. He was able to get his bearings quickly. It was a guard building though one Mash had never been to. He wondered when and why Jill had visited but didn't get to ask. There were several guards in the building and they weren't prepared for 7 people teleporting into the middle of it. Especially not people drenched in cold water. Half of whom were shivering and rubbing their hands together nervously. Some of the people were looking around. Mash shot them glares which were enough to persuade them into not running. Mash glanced away from the prisoners and turned to the guards. His gaze passed over the carpet he stood on, it was already wet. Mash frowned at the guards. They were still confused and stumbling about randomly. Knights should have been more disciplined, more orderly. Jill sat down and began recovering her mana even without a dedicated skill. Most people meditated or sat to recover more quickly. She didn't seem even slightly concerned by the situation. That was careless, but he guessed that they were safe enough. Mash had almost no energy left, and Jill was mostly out of mana too. Mash kept looking around and finally found someone more important looking arriving. The knight was taller than the other though height didn't mean much. It was the half-dozen embellishments on his armor that told Mash their rank. Several lines were engraved into one of the arms of their armor. 7 of them indicated they were a general. Something like that. His father had taught Mash to recognize ranks when he was younger but it hadn't stuck in his head. The general was wearing their helm, and visor down as if they were prepared for a fight. Mash saw the metal helm shift slowly and stiffly. The movement belonged to a puppet or golem, not a human. After taking in the situation, their gaze ended on Mash. Take the prisoners to jail. Mash, I hope your brother has a good explanation for this. Damn, it was supposed to be my day off too. The voice was feminine yet deep, and that surprised Mash. The armor indicated that she was a foot or 2 taller than Mash, and she had the bulk to go along with the height. That was all he could get from her too. The knights, who had been stunned, began running around. They were definitely trying to make up for their earlier mistakes. One of the apprentice knights walked up to Jill and handed her a towel. Then he handed one to Mash as well. The towel was grainy and not of good quality, but it did its job. He got as much water off as he could, as the general walked down beside him. Hello. I'm Mash, but I guess you knew that. He spoke somewhat awkwardly. He was still drying his hair as he talked. A little bit of magic would have let him dry off instantly, but he chose to conserve his energy. The general nodded towards him and responded. I am High General Urkish. Has your brother not mentioned me? That is a little disappointing to hear. The general took off her helmet and revealed a slightly wrinkled face. The woman was old but beautiful. Her wrinkles didn't take away from that. Instead, it gave her the appearance of a well-respected elder. Of someone who had both experience and power. It may have just been her appearance, but it made Mash want to answer her. He was familiar enough with unnatural influence to suspect that this might be an aura or another skill. No. Mash gave a simple answer, though it didn't convey what he wanted it to. His brother hadn't said much, but he didn't need to. The general's name was enough. Even though with his poor knowledge of important people, he had heard of the castle keeper. She was famous. A general as legendary as the king. In fact, this general had been famous even before the current king. She existed in the history books that he had been forced to read as a kid. An immortal, and one that had lived the life of one. Mash couldn't muster an intelligent thought or anything of the like. Even the king himself wasn't considered in the same realm as she was. The gods had stories and stuff, but they were gods. This was a human with feats that were recorded in history rather than myth. Not that there weren't plenty of those around for someone like this. The most important thing though was the fact that she was one of his heroes. It might have been the influence of his father, but he didn't care. He floundered in front of the legend and looked to Jill to recover the situation. Although Jill was staring just as hard as he was. The general was looking at Mash and then Jill. She didn't say anything as her eyes lingered on Jill for a moment. It stretched for a while and Jill turned away awkwardly. Mash's mind took a second to catch up to what he saw. The general was staring at Jill suspiciously, and there was only one reason he could think of. She knew what class Jill had, or had some way to figure out. That was bad, and Mash started to force out some words. He needed to change the subject. These people are foreigners. One of them had thrown breaker, and another had a sealing skill. Mash just talked about the first thing that came to his mind. There was no order to his words, and there hasn't been a proper explanation either. The general's face was situationally easy to read, and Mash could see eyebrows raise at the mention of foreigners. It was a small gesture that only lasted for the briefest second. Although she obviously didn't care as much about the rest. Thronebreaker never deserved its name. It can barely even be called a legendary weapon. The older woman shook her head while staring off into the distance. Her gaze had drifted past Jill though, so he took it as a victory. The general was remembering a past fight against someone who had wielded the weapon in the past. None of that was known to Mash, who interrupted the general's memory with a question. Mash didn't hesitate to continue turning the general's attention away from Jill. General Urkish, is the kingdom going to go to war? The greater implications of what had just happened finally wormed their way into Mash's mind. He tried to remember when the last major war was, and he couldn't actually remember it. Was it before the current king? It was definitely before his lifetime, but that didn't say much. His power didn't magically make him older, even if other people treated him like it did. The general would probably know more about the results of this kind of discovery. She might even be the one to make the final decision as far as he knew. Possibly. It will depend on the full story we get from a more credible source. In this case that would be your brother. Even if in the case that it would, we would seek reparations from the foreign king first. Most other kingdoms would back off after a failed attempt like this, but you can never know for certain. I have met my fair share of foolish kings. Mash listened attentively. He would have listened obediently even if the general had refused to answer his question. The general had implied that Mash wasn't a credible source, but he didn't care or dispute the claim. Mash considered trying to say something else but stopped himself as the general turned her gaze on him. Where is your brother? He's with the remaining prisoners. Once Jill recovers she will get them. There are a few more people. Mash was too eager to answer the question and had spoken carelessly. He had brought the conversation back to Jill and even looked toward her. That was a failure on his part, but it was probably too late regardless. If the general had a way to see a person's class, then his attempts at a distraction would go in vain. Mash stared at the general, trying to see how she reacted. Even if the older woman was a legend, Jill could probably get away if needed. His attention was solely focused on her, but the general just turned away and started walking away. She spoke with finality as she strode off. Your brother will handle the rest. I hope we meet in more pleasant circumstances next time. Her tone implied that nothing more should be said, and Mash kept his mouth rightfully shut. Jill was still staring at the general, and Mash realized that she was even more stunned by the encounter than Mash was. It seemed like she was an even bigger fan than him. He sat down beside Jill, and they began excitedly muttering about what had just happened. Chapter 260, Prelude. Mash waited with Jill until she had recovered. Another few teleports and she had returned with his brother, Red, and all of the remaining prisoners. They were all quickly escorted away this time. The knights were prepared this time and didn't panic upon the arrival of new people. It helped that they had been warned by the general. It was handled professionally, and the prisoners were never given the chance to flee or even protest. They were hauled away without even getting their injuries treated. Although none of them had anything too bad. The worst Mash had seen who was burned and frostbitten at the same time. An odd combination, but the knights didn't bat an eye at the sight now. Either his brother's presence or the general's were enough to dispel any disorder among the knights. At the end of it all, Mash was prepared to leave and find Luke but was stopped. A man in a uniform rather than armor had approached him. Well, not him, the man had approached Jill specifically. When he stepped into Mash's domain, Mash stared in surprise. He didn't feel anything from the man. No emotions, mana, or life. Even Red, who was an undead, gave off an aura of life. It was almost like the man didn't even exist. Priscilla didn't seem to know anything either. Mash stared hard at the man and tried to figure out what was happening. He didn't wear armor but had a stiff purple uniform. It looked like the same uniform he saw on his brother but was dyed yellow. That wasn't the kingdom's colors, and Mash wondered why someone was wearing something like that. The uniform stood out, its garish color separating the man from everyone else. The general has requested your presence. Now, please follow me. The man could only be described as prim. From the stiffness of his uniform to his stoic voice, he was even primmer than a servant would be. His hair was heavily greased and combed back away from his forehead. He even had a small mustache that was kept to perfection and curved slightly near the ends. He finished speaking and turned abruptly. His uniform billowing out a little at the motion. Without waiting for a response, he started walking away. Jill glanced at Red, who only responded with a shrug. She then turned her gaze to him, and he just shrugged too. The only thing refusing would accomplish, was a whole lot of nothing. The shrugs done, they decided to follow the prim man. The man hadn't turned around once, so the three of them had to walk quickly to catch up. Despite the importance of the people inside, the building itself was plain. It was made of stone brick that was organized simply. Simple rooms lined straight hallways. He had caught glimpse of a simple training ground that was much smaller than the one his brother had at home. The man didn't give them much time to explore and only stopped once. He paused beside a door and turned to face them. The door wasn't fancy or anything. The door was just like any other, and the man opened it for them. He stood at the side and said nothing. His gaze was fixed on them, but he just stood there ominously. It was sufficiently creepy, and the three of them rushed in to avoid his eyes. The inside of the room wasn't particularly special either. It had a simple wooden desk, and the general sat behind it. Arthur was there too, but he stood and looked through a window that was behind the desk. It was aimed toward the city. Other than his brother, Mash noticed that Luke was there too. He sat at one of 4 chairs that were laid out in front of the desk. There were some papers on the desk, and it wasn't hidden at all. Mash could easily snoop, even without using his domain. Although his domain didn't let him actually read simple text. It was strange, but normal ink would just blend into the paper whereas magical ink would be plain as day to his skill. Mash didn't bother with trying to peep. It wasn't his business, and he didn't want to get more involved than he already was. The only thing he wanted to do was head back north and fight more monsters. He got the sneaking suspicion that fate had something else in mind for him. Please, sit down. The general spoke more politely now than she had before. Mash didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one, but he followed the others as they took seats beside Luke. The wooden chairs they sat on were simple and it creaked loudly as he sat. His body was heavier than it looked, and he was by far the heaviest among them. Mash was a little worried, but it managed to hold him. Mash heard the door behind him close, and the general leaned forward on her desk. She was still wearing most of her armor. Only her helm sat on one corner of the desk. The metal plates ground into the wooden table as she leaned on her elbows. She was about to speak, but Arthur barreled over her opportunity. The general wants to recruit you for war. Specifically, Jill. He spoke flatly, his tone was perfectly controlled. Mash seemed to be the only one who seemed to know that his brother was angry. Arthur didn't want him to accept the offer. His dislike radiated off of him like an aura, but his brother's face and voice gave nothing away. Although, you are all welcome to join. High-leveled individuals are always valuable. Mash nodded along. He knew some of this already and would have expected people to approach them earlier. Recruitment was something every kingdom partook in, and that would even extend to kidnapping at times. Perhaps that was what the previous group has planned. Or maybe they would have used him to get at his brother and sister. That seemed more likely to him. Mash considered what he wanted to do. The idea of fighting and killing countless people sounded sickening. Images of the people he had already killed hung in his mind. Even if the people were invading his home, he didn't want to kill so many people. They would just be following the orders of another, and in any case, he didn't care who ruled. The Adventurers Guild was an independent organization, but its many members didn't adhere to that code. No matter what king ruled, he would continue to live the way he wanted. Although, he had been paying his taxes. Well, Jill had been paying them for the entire group. Mash had actually forgotten that adventurers needed to pay for things like that. His thoughts were wandering and he snapped back to the conversation as Jill replied. We wouldn't mind helping if Arthur asked, but I don't want to become a pack mule or anything. Jill hadn't consulted with the rest of the group. Although her words received nods from all of them, Mash included. It was reasonable and the plain truth as far as he was concerned. If Arthur asked for it, Mash would join the battle without hesitation. His brother looked happy with the response. His brother's face didn't actually change, but now there was a gleam of triumph in his eyes. The general's face scrunched up for a moment, but only a moment. So, if I'm understanding this correctly, you will place one of those marks on Arthur and aid him in dire straits. You also have some method for instantaneous long-distance communication that functions independent of either person. She glanced at his brother's forearm. Priscilla's body could be seen coiling around it. The cloth of his uniform wasn't thick enough to hide her body. That alone wouldn't have alarmed Mash. It was the incredible accuracy of her statement. He had thought that she had a method to read classes, but it seemed like she could read far more than that. She was hinting that she knew some or all of what their skills did. Both situations were a little mind-boggling. He had never heard of any items or skills that let someone do that. Mash couldn't keep his mouth shut any longer. What level are you? Jill and Red turned to him. Mash hadn't been listening to what Jill had said in response. He just hoped he didn't miss anything too important. The general was also staring at Mash, and he had to wonder if he had interrupted her by mistake. Interrupting his friends was one thing and doing the same to a renowned general was an entirely different matter. Mash coughed awkwardly as the silence lingered. Sorry. Mash apologized and trailed off as his brother stared at him. Even without any words, Mash could tell that Arthur was chastising him for his rudeness. Asking someone for their level was considered inappropriate at the very least and could even lead to fights in some situations. He really should not have asked that, but to his surprise, the general started chuckling. She seemed more amused than offended. Ha! The last person to ask me that was young Puck. And I will give you the same answer I gave him. I am the highest leveled person on this continent. There was so much confidence behind the grin she gave, that Mash could only believe that she was being completely honest. The words passed into Mash's ears, and he froze. The highest what? No, that didn't make any sense. What about the gods? What about the world owner? Now that he was thinking about it, would the world owner even have levels? He knew that levels weren't a comprehensive statement of strength, but still, how? At that moment he would have joined the knights if he thought it would get him a straight answer. That probably wouldn't happen, right? He shook his slightly but was intensely focused on the older woman now. It might be a little cheap, but now he was a little more invested in the conversation. He was always listening, but now he was paying way more attention. Red spoke before anyone else could, her voice was cold and haughty. You are using a skill, aren't you? My grandfather had something similar. The first part of her statement was for the general, but the latter was directed at everyone else. Mash instantly started letting out his anti-magic. His instincts, or rather Priscilla's instincts, kicked into overdrive. She started forcing him to use anti-magic, but it didn't work. He couldn't notice anything change. His domain didn't show him anything either. Despite all that, he trusted Red. He jumped to his feet and pushed the chair back so that it would fall loudly. He didn't know what the skill's trigger was or if there was a way to break it, but he would try. The chair clattering didn't seem to change anything either. It didn't even serve to draw anyone's attention. Priscilla, did you notice anything? Nothing, is she certain? I should be able to notice any changes. Mash felt Priscilla was scanning his body thoroughly, but she was getting no results. Jill tried to teleport out. The space around her blurred, and she vanished for an instant, but she reappeared in the same place. Instead of stopping her from teleporting, it was more like she had just teleported in place. Their escape plan was gone now too. Fighting was a terrible option, but Mash couldn't think of another. He didn't want to fight the general, especially not if what she had said earlier was true, and he was suspecting that it was. Behind the door was the servant, and Mash suspected that the man would be stronger than he had appeared. So he threw his fist at the ground. Claws started growing up his arm, as the muscles puffed noticeably.